What's up, party people? So this is going to be a video basically just following along with how I study Lamentations. And like I said in the overview, I'm just going to go through some key verses here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I read the whole thing first. So you can pause the video and do that if you haven't already. Just read Lamentations chapter 1 real quick, and then we'll go through and pick apart some of the verses. So after you read through, we're going to read these verses, Lamentations, and I literally just paused the video and read this chapter again just to make sure that it was completely fresh in my mind. Chapter 1 to me is, it's your fault and I'll do the right thing and ask for mercy. Chapter 1, there's a big difference here I alluded to in the overview, which is in Job is the most often quoted suffering book of the Bible. Like, here's how to deal with suffering. Here's what to do when suffering happens. And I think Job definitely can offer us some insight into proper posture before God and, how to deal with the circumstances of life that we didn't ask for sure. I think there are applications there, but I also think that Lamentations is probably more applicable than most people want to admit, because Lamentations right here is saying, you guys messed up and these are the consequences of your sin. That's a big part of Lamentations, is we rebelled against what God told us to do, and because of that, we're reaping the consequences here. So there's a huge difference between Job and Lamentations. I think that people want Job to be their story. They want to believe they're righteous. That's just another form of pride. That's just another form of sin, to be frank about it. So when we look here, a lot of the consequences in our lives that are negative happen because we don't follow God's ordered way. And that's not always, sometimes it's very obvious and other times it's not. But both books are about suffering. And there are some key verses here that I really want to hone in on. So I'm going to read some verses here. Verse 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become. She who is great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. And so that's a big intro. How lonely. So it's talking about the fullness of Jerusalem, and then how empty, how powerful, and then now they're like a slave. This reversal of fortune really sets the stage for what's happening. Obviously, they were overpowered by a great enemy, and this is what has happened. And they were overpowered because of the sin that they exhibited, which we'll get to in a little bit. At this point, I'm going to take a second and just say, I often just look over here. This is a good note here. How? An exclamation often associated with expressions of grief. How could this have happened, right? Note the contrasts. Full of people, lonely. Great, to a widow. Princess, to a slave. Jerusalem's losses are terrible. It's trying to show that they have lost just about everything. And if you doubt that, when we get to some of the other chapters, some of the consequences are just horrifying to think about. So verse 1, one last thing that I'm going to point out in this video before I keep reading these verses is, this is an acrostic. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 characters, and this starts with the first letter, and I think I'm going to butcher this, but the how in Hebrew is ekha, I think, and it's how. That occurs in several chapters. It starts that way, but it's an acrostic poem, so it's actually a very high form of poetry in Hebrew tradition. So she who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave, right? We're going to skip to verse 5. Her foes have become the head, her enemies prosper, because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away, captives before the foe. So in poetry, you often see like a lot of language to suffering. So verses 1 through 4 are suffer, suffer, suffer. And then 5, there's a little bit of a flip here, and it says it's because, right? So it's giving you this next part, which is, why is this happening? How could this have happened? I'll tell you how. The Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. And again, this is a poetic form, her can refer to Jerusalem. So then we're going to skip down to verses 8 through 9. Jerusalem sinned grievously, therefore she became filthy. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Therefore her fall is terrible. She has no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. And again, this is poetic language. So sometimes, like verse 9, her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. I immediately thought of like illegitimate children or being pregnant or something like that. But that you have to understand that they would also carry things in their skirts. So there are instances where people are given grain and they're taking their skirts and they're putting something in it, whether it's meat or grain or something that they need to carry. And so basically, her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Basically, it's saying she was carrying this rebellion and sin and everything. Now, could that be an allusion to pregnancy? Yeah, it could be a reference to that as well, but not necessarily. It could also just be that she was carrying her rebellion around. So that's, with poetic language, you have to fit it in with the greater context. So that's something that you can look out as you read through here. I would challenge you to look at some of the symbolism and go, wow, that's powerful. And if it speaks to you, ask what it means in particular. In verses 18 and 19, so we have, the Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. The Lord is in the right. So after all the suffering, the Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear all you peoples and see my suffering. My young women and my young men have gone into captivity. I called to my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and elders perished in the city while they sought food to revive their strength. So the people that were around them, I called to my lovers, the people that were around that I thought I could count on, they deceived. And the priests and elders perished in the city. We'll find out later that the priests and elders were not doing as they should have either. And so we also have verse 22. Let all their evil doing come before you and deal with them as you have dealt with me because of all my transgressions. For my groans are many and my heart is faint. So we have these verses. So verse 1, Jerusalem has been laid low and lonely, like just completely afflicted. In verse 5, the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of transgressions. So we see the Lord actually being the cause of this. Throughout the book, we see a desperate hunger for God's presence. And going back to symbolism, this is a hunger for literal food, but the prophet here is doing something really beautiful where he's saying this hunger for food is the same hunger for the presence of God, which has been withdrawn because they haven't confessed their sin. And so unconfessed sin needs to be dealt with, and we need to approach God that way, with confessed sin, repentant. Even with confessed sin, there are still consequences to deal with. Israel's downfall didn't happen overnight. Nations take a lot longer to turn around than a person or a household or even a community. And so this poetry reflects that. And I think it's important to point out, you can be fully forgiven, but still need to deal with the consequences of your actions. So they could repent right at the moment that they notice something is wrong, but that's not going to mean that Babylon is going to all of a sudden poof, disappear, and that they're just going to have food overnight and all of that. That's not how it works. Verses 8 through 9, Jerusalem and God's people have sinned grievously. Again, the main difference between Lamentations and Job is that Lamentations is attributed to the sins of the nation, the people, and the priesthood of individual people doing the wrong thing, as well as the nation doing the wrong thing. When all three types of government fail, the nation's not thinking about the future, and a great fall is coming. That's something that we see in verses 8 and 9. The three governments being family, church, and magistrate, like political power. All three of them have breakdowns that we see throughout these chapters. In verses 18 through 19, it says the Lord is in the right. Rebellion is punishable, and God will discipline his children. The lovers that were there for the good times are gone. They don't care anything about Jerusalem and her destruction. The hunger mentioned here is a real hunger, and as we see in later chapters, it's apparently a very horrible famine. But it's also, again, symbolic of the people's hunger for relief and for God's presence. God's going to judge people who are doing evil, the same as Israel was judged for their evil. So in verse 22, let all their evil doing come before you. Now, with that delivered line, there is no pretense either. The author is pointing out here that the people that did evil are going to be punished, and that's something that Israel can take a little bit of solace in. But the point is not that these other people are going to be punished because we're righteous. No, the point, it's there's no pretense there. The author knows that the evil done by the other nation does not excuse Israel for the evil that they've done that led to this situation in the first place. Two wrongs don't make a right. And that's on full display here, right? And in their suffering, the physical destruction of this chapter mirrors their spiritual destruction and their spiritual loneliness and the fact that God will not be around sin. God is holy. So we need to approach humbly and repentant and confessing our sin before God. This is even before Jesus. So the way that they would have done that is through sacrifice. They would have made sacrifices to approach God and confess sin, right? They understood there was something that needed to happen. But later on, obviously, Christ is the one that solidifies that bridges that gap that we could never bridge. So it's a very good little chapter here. I encourage you to read through and really let the depravity of the situation sink in. When you get to chapter 2, the Lord is destroyed without pity. You can see right here. I mean, it really is a really bad situation in Lamentations. So that's where I'm going to leave it for now with chapter 1. Hope that was helpful and that you got something out of that. Read chapter 2 before you come back tomorrow, or read through the whole book every day is what I tend to do on shorter books like this. Just read it every day for 5 days. So there's that. Anyways, like and subscribe to catch all these videos as they come out, and I'll catch you in the next one. All right. Peace.